This is a short summary of what we covered in British North America Lesson 2, where we looked at the story of the Loyalists. Now, this slideshow will give you the pages where we got information, but essentially we set the class up as a jigsaw. So the people were broken into different groups, and then they brought their piece back to this jigsaw to give us a complete understanding. If we start down here in the common Loyalist experience, we looked at what it was that people went through that was fairly consistent no matter where they came from and no matter where they were going, if they were a Loyalist, which, by the way, can also be said as a United Empire Loyalist, okay? We looked at the methods of travel. Well, as you can see up here, they often traveled by horse or wagon or by foot. Boat was also a common method of transportation because it could get you pretty far pretty fast. We also looked at how they might feel. Well, a journey like that is really tiring. You're often scared because you've just left your home. You're often hungry too, because it's not like you can stop at a grocery store on the way along. Your food was provided by your farm, and you're no longer on your farm. So it's difficult to take much food with you. So they were tired, hungry, scared, and there's a lot of change, a lot of unknown for them. When we read about the Loyalist experiences, we also looked at why they were leaving. I'm pretty sure you can piece that together from our past lesson too, things with the rebels and their treatment. But we also realized that some Loyalists, at least we realized with the reading that we did for this lesson, some Loyalists weren't truly Loyalists. They were actually more in favor with the rebels. At least they were thinking more along the lines of the rebels. They were not happy with the king. However, if they did not appear rebel enough, they might have been asked to leave. If you think about it, if you had any connections to someone who belonged to the British Army, then you might be willing to help that person during a war. And for that reason, the rebels did not want people with potential ties to Loyalists to be living in what's going to become the United States. So some people were actually asked to leave, and they became Loyalists simply because of that circumstance. There were also people called, people who became escorted Loyalists. So they actually had, it's almost like a tour group, like they traveled together and someone helped them get north. So that might be if there was a father who was fighting for the British, the mother and the children, if they had the money to do it, they might get escorted north so that they wouldn't have to defend themselves against any dangers. They would have somebody to show them the way and to help them provide food. Just if you were an escorted Loyalist, if you had that escort to go north, they would not take sons who were age 12 or older because those sons were too close to fighting age, and they did not want to provide the enemy, the British, with their with a new army, with new soldiers. So if you were in that circumstance, that was a pretty tough choice to make. Then we looked at the different stories. I'm going to start up here. You'll notice there are 2 bullets, and I've asked for the first one to be a rough estimate of the number of people that immigrated, and the second bullet to tell the story of these people. You can feel free to reduce this to 9-point font if you need to. So the rough estimate for the Maritimes, about 30,000. And their story, these people flooded the Maritimes provinces. The Acadians were living there, and to have such a huge influx of British population really changed things. And typically the French and the British aren't really buddy-buddy, so it made things a little more complicated because they had very differing viewpoints. So what they did is they created 2 different colonies. We got the colonies of New Brunswick and Cape Breton in order to give them different boundaries so that they could not have as much cultural conflict. The African American Loyalists, there were about 3,000 of these. They came here because they were promised free land and they were promised freedom. A bunch of them had been slaves. They didn't get all that they were promised. A bunch did not get land. They got poor quality land when they did get land. And they had a very difficult time finding jobs. So they were discriminated against. This culminated in a race riot where their homes were burned, rocks were thrown at them. I know you don't expect to hear that in the history of our country, but it did happen. And as a result, there were people who felt that this was wrong, but felt somewhat powerless to do much about it because there were so many others who were showing the racial discrimination. So those people who wanted to support the African American loyalists, they pooled their money together and rented a ship, passage on a ship, so that anyone who wanted to leave could board that ship and be taken to Sierra Leone, which is a country over in Africa. So the short recap of that is that they faced discrimination and a race riot, and many of them took a ship to Sierra Leone to leave. The Mohawk. This one I don't have exact numbers. I think it's about 20 to 22 families. I'm just not exactly sure how the families are calculated. And they moved to areas like this. Tyendinaga area is Mohawk. And Joseph Brant was one of the leaders there. And you may notice that there's a lot of people with the last name Brant who live in this area. The other large group of Mohawk went down to Brantford. Because again, Brant is a common last name for Mohawk. They were promised a lot more land than what they received. It turned out that other people came in with these pieces of paper, these deeds that guaranteed them land, and the large section that was originally promised the Mohawk kept getting shifted to be smaller and smaller and smaller because of these other people getting deeds of land. The promise to the Mohawk had been verbal, only it was not on paper, which is more consistent with the Mohawk tradition, but it meant that the government was able to remember their promise and adjust things. The Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois, there were 5,000 of them, and they came mainly as refugees. Their villages down in the what's now the U.S. had been burned down, and they came here to seek refuge. In Lower Canada, there were about 2,000 immigrants that came in. They settled a lot along the water, and it began the blending of cultures to have more British intermingled with the French. In Upper Canada, we had 7,500, which was a significant population and a significantly British population. So that's actually how Upper Canada was born. It was separated from Lower Canada in order to provide separate British culture area to that of the French. So Upper Canada was created because of this influx of the population. Down here, when we look at the way the Loyalists influenced our country, well, we already know from our last lesson that the values of the people who came influenced our country because we're known as being more peaceful, and they were choosing something other than war as their way to handle the situation. But now we also have a far larger population. It's also a much more culturally diverse population. Even though the start was a little bit rocky, we've become a multicultural country, and that's in part because of all these cultures that were accepted early on. We also got a lot of new colonies, which will later transform into provinces. So ones like New Brunswick, Upper Canada, which becomes Ontario, Lower Canada, which becomes Quebec. These new provincial boundaries, at that time new colonies, led to the provinces that we have today.